The year was 1955. The world was in the heat of the Cold War, but Southeast Asia burned with an even more brutal war. This war was none other than the Vietnam War. What had initially started as merely a chess game between the superpowers would eventually become a deadly struggle for the soul of Vietnam. It would shatter the nation of Vietnam, fill the jungles with blood, divide the American populace, and eventually cost the lives of over 3 million people. The unthinkable would also happen, a US defeat. But how did this happen? How did a simple tussle lead to a bloody war that lasted for over 2 decades? To find out, we'll have to go to the very beginning. In 2879 BCE, long before the devastating war, Vietnam was a land covered in lush, green forests and rivers. This land was tucked in the easternmost part of the Indochinese peninsula. It was bordered by China's towering mountains in the north, Laos and Cambodia to the west, and the South China Sea to the east. Vietnamese legends say that the land was ruled by a great emperor, Emperor Hung Vuong. Emperor Hung ruled the Vietnamese, and under his rule, they discovered the secrets of wet rice agriculture. It was also under his rule that the people began to master the production of bronze tools. Emperor Hung and his descendants ruled over the Vietnamese for a long time, and were the ones who laid the foundations of Vietnamese civilization. But this peace would not last forever. By 257 BCE, a Chinese general by the name of Thuc Phan marched into Vietnam and overthrew the last Hung king. Thuc Phan started to unite the Vietnam tribes into a kingdom and established Co La Citadel as its capital. Being a Chinese general, he indulged in trade between China and Vietnam, expanding the borders. But even Thuc Phan wouldn't reign forever. A storm was brewing, and he would soon be caught in it. By 111 BCE, 2 sisters known as Trung Trac and Trung Ni started a rebellion. This rebellion, like a flame, spread across the whole of Vietnam. These 2 women led an army that became a revolution, taking back Vietnam from the Chinese. However, China would not take this lying down. To claim back Vietnam, they sent several generals and troops. Vietnam fought, but the sisters were tragically murdered, and once again, Vietnam fell under Chinese rule. This rule lasted for almost 1,000 years until 938 CE. During this period, the Han rulers imposed Chinese culture on the Vietnamese. They wanted the Vietnamese to adopt their customs, their laws, and even their religions like Buddhism and Taoism.
Near Hue An in central Vietnam, My Son Sanctuary is one of the most significant Hindu temples.
However, the Vietnamese resisted. Revolts were springing up across the nation, with several structures being set on fire. Worried, the Chinese sent another Han general, Ma Yuan, to put an end to these uprisings, but the Vietnamese couldn't be controlled. They had a hero, a brave Vietnamese general named Ngo Quyen. He led the Vietnamese to battle, eventually leading them to the Dong River in the Battle of Bac, where he defeated the Chinese Han dynasty. This victory brought Vietnam independence and started Ngo's dynasty. But independence didn't solve everything. Ngo's dynasty would eventually be overthrown by another Vietnamese known as Dinh Bo Linh in 968 CE. Dinh Bo Linh was a man with a different mind who had one goal: to unify Vietnam. He introduced a truly imperial system and made the capital of the state, Hoa Lu. He also began to plant seeds of Buddhism, but just when this dynasty was getting settled in, Dinh Bo Linh was assassinated in 979 CE, and in came the Lai dynasty, Lai Tai. To had his agenda, he wanted to unify Vietnam under a common culture. So as soon as he got on the throne, he moved the capital to Thang Long. Under this dynasty, Vietnam prospered. For the first time in history, the Vietnamese were adopting a religion, Buddhism, and increasing their territory. Little by little, this dynasty helped shape Vietnam's borders into those of modern-day Vietnam. And just when you thought Vietnam would have peace, internal conflicts started brewing, and the Tran family overthrew the Lai dynasty in 1225 CE. The Tran dynasty was powerful. They proved they were worthy of being Vietnamese rulers by passing almost impossible tests. They managed to strengthen national unity and fend off 3 invasions by the Mongolians, but that was not enough. by 1400 CE, they were overthrown by the Ho dynasty. Ho Kwai Liai probably thought he would be much luckier and attempted reforms. However, this was not to be. The Vietnamese resisted his rule, and while he managed to deal with inside attacks, he was unable to fight external ones. He was eventually overthrown by the Chinese Ming, barely 7 years into his reign. The Chinese were back, despite their return. They didn't have the time to drop their bags. Vietnamese forces resisted their return and successfully chased them out once again by 1427 CE. This pursuit was led by another national hero, known by the name of Le Loi. Like Ngo, he started the Le dynasty as Vietnam regained its independence. However, by 1527, Vietnam once again fell into chaos. The Mac family led a coup and kicked the Le dynasty out of the throne. But even they wouldn't last long. Right from when Mac Dang Dung took power, he began a battle with rivals loyal to the Le dynasty. He was overthrown by these forces, and Vietnam was in utter chaos. Revolution broke across the country, with several leaders sprouting across the state. The Nguyen lords in the south and the Trinh lords in the north. Vietnam was torn and in a crisis. It was this crisis that opened the doors of Vietnam to even bigger problems than they could have imagined: foreign invaders from Europe. You see, these foreign invaders didn't come with guns blowing at first. Initially, they had come holding Bibles as missionaries and with promises of trade. But this was thick in the time of European imperialism, and European nations were scrambling to establish colonies across the globe. It was at this period that France set its eyes on Southeast Asia, most especially in Vietnam. Though the French had come to Vietnam as traders and missionaries, they arrived to find the Nguyen lords and the Trinh lords locked in battle. Vietnam was in chaos. The French saw this as a prime opportunity and took their chance. They quickly set up the French Catholic Church and began converting the people to Christianity. The Vietnamese lords wouldn't stop fighting, and back at home, France was thirsty for colonies. With this gap, the French decided this was a chance to take control. In 1858, something happened that would change Vietnam forever. In 1858, a man called Napoleon III led the France invasion of Vietnam.
Returns to its colony of Indochina to bring it back into the fold of the French Empire. But the Vietnamese Communist
They launched an attack on Da Nang in a fight to claim Vietnam. However, the Vietnamese were not going to take it lying down. They rallied their forces and fought the French. This fight lasted for almost 4 years. But the Vietnamese were ill-prepared and weary from their endless tussle of many years. By 1862, France had their first victory. They captured the city of Saigon and forced Tu Duc, the Vietnamese emperor, to sign a treaty. This treaty would hand over all the southern states of Vietnam to the French. It was known as the Treaty of Saigon. This was the beginning of French rule in Vietnam. However, France had eyes on more than Vietnam. Britain, another European superpower, controlled India and Burma. France needed to solidify their control in South Asia and also to create a buffer zone between them and the British colonies, so they also wanted to capture Vietnam's neighbors Laos and Cambodia. Napoleon III was also very interested in the resources of these regions. He wanted control of Cambodia's rubber, Laos's minerals, and Vietnam's rice. So he wasn't content with just southern Vietnam. He led the French troops to conquer Tonkin, which was in northern Vietnam, and Annam in central Vietnam. They would also conquer Vietnamese neighbors, Cambodia and Laos. All three were joined together into French Indochina in 1887. While the French celebrated their success, something interesting was happening among the Vietnamese people. Like the Chinese, France also tried to replace Vietnamese culture with French culture. First, they made Saigon the crown of Indochina, where all the French elites lived. Then, they started building European-style buildings and filling the market with luxury goods. But this wasn't the only problem. Vietnamese farmers were forced to grow rice and work ruthlessly every day, only to see their grains set off in the French trade. Despite their hard labor, they still paid heavy taxes and lost their land. Soon, the people went past just mumbling about the cruelty of the French government and began to plan a resistance. Revolts sprang up across the state, but every time they tried, The French government was quick to squash those attempts, until one man sprung up. He was the only man who could cause real change. That man was Ho Chí Minh. Ho Chí Minh was born during the French rule in Vietnam. From a young age, he saw how his people suffered under the French. He was constantly plagued by these thoughts. When he attended the National Academy in Hue, he spoke up against the French in Indochina, and he was expelled. But that didn't quench his desire for knowledge or his dream of an independent Vietnam, one that was free from French colonial rule. After being expelled, Ho Chí Minh spent his time traveling the world and ended up visiting the United States and even living in Paris. By the end of World War I, Ho Chí Minh was excited about the Versailles Peace Conference. He saw it as a chance to bring forward the suffering of his people back at home. He was even more excited about sending his petition to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. This was because the U.S. president had championed self-determination in the past. When Ho Chí Minh was allowed to speak, he passionately demanded rights for the Vietnamese. He called for freedom of the press, the release of prisoners held by the French, and that Vietnam be given the right to independence. However, Ho Chí Minh was met with disappointment. Not only was he ignored by France, but he was also ignored by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson at the time was reluctant to offend France. It was at this point that he realized he would have to look for other means to free his people, no matter how drastic they could be. From then on, Ho Chí Minh became radicalized. Realizing that help would not come from the West, he began to focus on communist ideologies and ideas. He went back home, but he was far from defeated. Upon returning, he found his people even more repressed than he left them. This caused him to start a nationalist movement to bring the Vietnamese together against the French government. He started a party known as the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which would later become the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930. The Indochinese Communist Party was a group of other people who thought like Ho. It was made up of workers, farmers, and other intellectuals who all wanted to free Vietnam from French colonial rule. With this party, Ho Chí Minh called for independence. He asked the Vietnamese to take on weapons, as this was the only way they could free themselves. While he tried, he was still unable to fully fight the French forces. However, by 1940, the world outside of Vietnam was burning. The Second World War had begun. France moved most of their focus to Germany, but before the Vietnamese could even celebrate, Japan had already spotted the opportunity. Taking advantage of a distracted France, they invaded Vietnam and took over. However, even though they installed a regime, this regime was still very controlled by France. But Ho Chí Minh wasn't sitting down with his arms folded. He wasn't going to watch yet another country oppress his people. He had to come up with a plan. Even though he had the ICP and the members of his party were determined, they were small and would not be able to defeat the French. He needed the support of the people. So, the following year, 1931, he did something remarkable. He formed a coalition of both the communist members of his party and the Vietnamese nationals. This coalition was known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh had one goal. This goal was to bring every Vietnamese person, irrespective of their beliefs, together to fight against foreign rule. Now remember that while all of this was happening, France was fighting World War II. They had no time for whatever was happening in Vietnam. The Viet Minh saw this distraction and began the struggle to win people over and start a resistance against the Japanese and the French. Ho Chí Minh led this group to begin their fight using guerrilla tactics. These were small, fast, and highly coordinated strikes against Japanese forces. He also had generals like Vo Nguyen Giap, who joined him in leading these guerrilla tactics against the Japanese. These attacks were known as the August Revolution of 1945. By September, something thought unimaginable happened. The World War was ending, and Japan was no longer strong enough to hold on to Vietnam. Noticing their weakness, Ho Chí Minh and the Viet Minh intensified their efforts and eventually took control of Hanoi. On the 2nd of September, 1945, Ho Chí Minh stood in front of a massive crowd in Ba Dinh Square and declared Vietnam's independence. He paraphrased the Declaration of the United States, saying all men were created equal, and called for the Vietnamese right to freedom and self-determination. The people celebrated Ho Chi Minh. He had become a national hero. However, this joy wouldn't last long as France had other plans. As World War II came to an end, they returned to take control of their prized colony, only to find that Vietnam had declared itself free of colonial rule. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh refused to let go of this independence and stood up to the French forces. However, by December 1946, France had enough and decided to take back the colony by force. They marched in Haiphong with tens of thousands of soldiers and military tanks, taking the standoff into a full-blown war. This attack at Haiphong left over 2,000 Vietnamese killed. The French army grew to 190,000 soldiers. These soldiers weren't just French forces. They were also part of their colonial troops from Senegal and North Africa. After the attack at Haiphong, using their modern weapons and artillery, including air support, they were able to also take over major cities in Vietnam, like Hanoi and Saigon. Their goal was to completely crush the Viet Minh. Back on the global stage, tensions arose over colonial controls. However, the West, including the United States, noticed that Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam were getting support from communist states like China and the Soviet Union. They then decided it was best Vietnam was under French colonialism than left to the Red Bandits. The Viet Minh was greatly outnumbered. In total, Ho Chi Minh and his troops were about 50,000 in number. However, these men weren't all soldiers. The majority of them were ordinary villagers and farmers who didn't exactly know how to fight. The only thing they knew was that they wouldn't give up Vietnam to the French forces again. One of Ho Chi Minh's generals, Vo Nguyen Giap, was a man who, like Ho Chi Minh, was also well-read. He had traveled to Europe and had learned several warfare tactics. Seeing that they were outnumbered and not very skilled, Vo Nguyen Giap knew they could not defeat the French in conventional warfare. So, he led the Viet Minh groups as they attacked using guerrilla warfare. They would use hit-and-run tactics on the French forces, leaving them constantly confused and on the edge. His goal was to wear them down before even considering matching them head-on. The Viet Minh troops would hide in the bushes and ambush French patrols. They would sabotage supply lines, and just when the French troops thought they could breathe a sigh of relief, the Viet Minh would attack again. These strikes were always hard, fast, and disastrous for the French forces. They hadn't been prepared for this sort of warfare. The French had greatly underestimated the bravery of the Vietnamese people and planned one-and-done warfare. However, Vietnam had rugged terrain, dense forests, and mountains, and this only helped the Vietnamese. Vo Nguyen Giap knew this terrain and was able to lead his troops to attack and disappear into the night. Ho Chi Minh, on the other hand, knew they needed more numbers and had to win the minds of the people, so he was involved in propaganda campaigns. He preached against colonialism and encouraged the people to join in the fight for an independent Vietnam. The Viet Minh sent out pamphlets, used posters, and even held rallies to win people over. Also, whenever the Viet Minh were able to take control of a territory during the war, they would take lands from wealthy landlords and give them to the poor peasants. These actions greatly increased their popularity among the Vietnamese peasants who had suffered under French and Japanese rule. By the late 1940s, the majority of the people were fully behind the Viet Minh. However, the support of the people was not enough. Ho Chi Minh knew that they needed allies and external support, so he looked to Indochina's neighbor, China. You see, in 1949, the People's Republic of China gained independence. The following year, China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. China had established a communist government and was more favorable towards the communist-leaning Viet Minh than the French troops. By April 1950, Ho Chi Minh asked China for military aid, and they answered. They sent over weapons and logical support. They used the mountains of North Vietnam in Lao Cai and Lang Son to send these weapons and support. They used the Lao Cai route to send military supplies, while Lang Son was great for the movement of troops. Noticing the lack of military knowledge among the Viet Minh troops, they also sent military advisors. These advisors formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group. By September of that year, China had sent thousands of rifles, artillery, and guns to Viet Minh. This made them stronger against the French forces. China also protected the Vietnamese north. But as China supported France, the French weren't the only ones panicking. The United States was also starting to get worried. You see, when the war first started, the Americans were slightly sympathetic towards Vietnamese efforts for independence. However, by 1950, the Cold War had already begun, and they saw Vietnam getting support from communist sides. They were afraid that if Vietnam fell to communism, then all of Southeast Asia would fall too. So, they finally decided to listen to the pleas of the French for support. President Harry Truman, the then President of the United States, approved the sum of $15 million to help France beat the Viet Minh. They also continued granting more support as the war dragged on. However, now that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh army had Chinese assistance, their troops grew to almost 100,000 soldiers. In that same year, they were able to launch a major attack in the north. They targeted French posts along the China border. Using more intense guerrilla tactics, they were able to force the French to retreat. This victory spread joy among the Viet Minh and the Vietnamese. It also solidified their support for China, but it was only the beginning. Everything was already starting to change. The Viet Minh began to regain several parts of Vietnam, including Hoa Binh, located in the west of Hanoi. The following year, France launched an attack on Hoa Binh. Very frustrated with fighting enemies they couldn't see or expect, they were hoping that they could draw Ho Chi Minh and his forces out into a one-on-one battle. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Giap led the Viet Minh forces to break through French lines and surround the French forces instead. Talk about an Uno reverse card. They refused to indulge in direct contact, and France eventually cowered and retreated. Once again, the Viet Minh had proved they could win the battle of attrition. The war continued to drag on, and while both sides suffered, no one was able to claim victory. However, merely 2 years later, in 1954, something happened that would change the course of the First Indochina War. The French made a deadly mistake. The mistake started in 1953 with a man named General Henri Navarre. General Henri was the leader of the French High Command. In late 1953, Navarre came up with an idea to establish a French military stronghold at Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was a remote valley near the Vietnamese border with Laos. His big plan was that if they had the command there, they would be able to cut off the supply lines from Vietnam to Laos. It would also be a great spot to launch an attack against the Viet Minh. So, they began the creation of this base. General Navarre made sure this case was fortified with airstrips and that they could resupply from the air. He was convinced that the French army had more weapons and, with air support, they would be able to defeat any Viet Minh attack. This would help them control the region. He couldn't have been more mistaken. Leading the Viet Minh forces was General Vo Nguyen Giap, a man General Navarre should have never underestimated. General Giap noticed the location of the French base in Dien Bien Phu, and instead of seeing a threat, he saw a massive opportunity. He immediately gathered about 40,000 troops, and they began to surround the base and cut off all the land supply routes to the valley. The French base was under siege, but General Giap knew that was not enough. Using impressive logistics, he and the Viet Minh forces were able to move heavy artillery through the rugged terrain of the valley. They dragged this artillery through the jungle and placed them on the mountains surrounding the base. General Giap knew that if they could position themselves on the high ground overlooking the valley, they would have the French base surrounded both on the ground and above. This would give them an advantage as they would be able to bombard the French troops from above and below. By March 13, 1954, General Giap and his troops were ready. They launched an attack on Dien Bien Phu, and it was the beginning of an intense fight. The French were surrounded by endless artillery fire from above and relentless attacks from land. The siege lasted for 56 days, with the Viet Minh attacking both day and night. They used a combination of conventional warfare and guerrilla tactics. The French forces thought they would be able to get air support, but even that failed. General Giap and his men specifically targeted their airstrips and transport planes. They were trapped. The French soldiers were dying, and they were unable to get supplies. As the casualties increased, French troops began to lose morale. However, despite their relentless attack, General Giap still had one final card up his sleeve. In May, he led the Viet Minh to launch a massive final attack on French positions in the valley. The French were overwhelmed and they gave up, with over 9,000 French soldiers surrendering to the Viet Minh. This victory sent shockwaves around the world. The Viet Minh had won, and Dien Bien Phu had fallen. It was the final blow for the French army. The war had become too costly to maintain, and they had no other choice but to leave Vietnam. It was their exit that led to the Geneva Conference of April 26, 1954. The aim of this conference was to deal with the issues from both the Korean War and the First Indochina War. There were multiple countries in attendance: France and Vietnam, who were represented by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, China, the United Kingdom, Laos, Cambodia, and even the United States and their arch-rival, the Soviet Union, were in attendance. The negotiations took place for over 70 days as they argued about the future of Vietnam. Finally, on July 21st, they were able to sign the Geneva Accords. Vietnam was free. It was agreed that no military personnel from foreign states should be allowed to enter Vietnam again unless requested by the local government. It was a huge victory for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, but their battle was far from over. It was only just beginning because, while Vietnam had been granted independence, some hidden seeds of discord were sown in Geneva. These seeds would only lead to a larger war that would never leave Vietnam the same. You see, even though the Geneva Accords granted Vietnam independence, they granted independence to a divided Vietnam. Initially, the Viet Minh was made up of all Vietnams, despite their beliefs. The only thing unifying them was a desire for independence. During the Geneva Conference, the thread holding this unity snapped, and Vietnam was divided into two zones in the 17th parallel. These two zones were North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam would be governed by the Viet Minh, who were staunch communists, while South Vietnam, which was more Western, would be governed under the former Emperor Bao Dai. Both sides were given 300 days to withdraw their troops and weapons, and go to their respective sides of the line. Vietnam was divided. However, Ho Chi Minh wasn't happy with this idea. His dream had been to see a united and independent Vietnam, and he and his supporters argued for this at the conference. Eventually, it was agreed that there would be nationwide elections in July 1956 to reunify Vietnam under one single government. It was a huge win for Ho Chi Minh because it meant that a democratic process would be used to determine Vietnam's future. However, this celebration had a sour side that only spelled doom from the very beginning. You see, many countries at the conference agreed to sign and uphold these agreements, including even China and France. However, the United States didn't. They insisted that they were not bound by these agreements, and their reasons were that they shared the sentiments of South Vietnamese leaders under Bao Dai. These South Vietnamese leaders didn't want to participate in elections that would bring in a communist government. The United States, as expected, was not pleased with the idea either. Nevertheless, the agreement had been signed, and both groups returned to their sides of Vietnam. North Vietnam had major cities like Hanoi, while South Vietnam had cities like Saigon. In the north, Ho Chi Minh continued to declare himself as the leader of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He strongly believed in his dream of a united and independent Vietnam under communism. After what happened at Versailles, he was convinced that true freedom would never come to Vietnam from the West. He continued his land reforms, giving lands to poorer peasants and setting up a collective farming system. Using propaganda, he also pushed the people to believe in Marxist-Leninist thoughts. Ho Chi Minh's government spoke about itself as the true champion of Vietnamese independence. After all, they were the ones who had fought off the French colonial powers. Ho Chi Minh was convinced that there would need to be a battle to unite Vietnam, and because of this, he created an army. This army was known as the People's Army of Vietnam. It was a strong and disciplined force that was trained by both Chinese and Soviet advisors. Seeing that North Vietnam leaned into communist ideals, the Soviets had also begun to offer support to Ho Chi Minh. However, in South Vietnam, it was an entirely different story. Both sides were as different as black and white. In the south, Ngo Dinh Diem had been elected as prime minister, and he created the Republic of Vietnam. He leaned towards the West, and for this reason, he was staunchly against communist ideas. He also returned the Catholic Church in South Vietnam. With the Catholic Church restored, he tried to force everyone to accept Christianity and stamp out other religions, including Buddhism, which had been brought by the Chinese. As you can imagine, the Buddhists in South Vietnam didn't like him very much, nor did they support his leadership. But Ngo Dinh didn't care for that. He believed he had the support of the West, including the United States. He had a goal. His goal was to build a capitalist state in South Vietnam. This goal would never fully prosper. This was because he wasn't a popular leader, and political opponents protested against him. Diem suppressed these protests, and soon enough, his government was one of nepotism and corruption. The communists in South Vietnam protested his government, and he tried to squash them. Anyone who would even attempt to disagree with him was gotten rid of. Soon enough, the people of South Vietnam began to crumble. While Diem continued with his aggressive rule, the people mumbled about how he was just another colonial figure. What was the difference between a Vietnamese who didn't care about them and a French colonial ruler? Soon enough, they began to form groups that would oppose him. These groups were far from Diem and around the countryside. They were also mostly made up of Viet Minh fighters who had fought against the French. While Ngo Dinh Diem struggled to squash his opposition, another pressure was also brewing outside of South Vietnam. Unknown to him, South Vietnam was about to explode. While Ngo Dinh Diem struggled to squash his opposition, another pressure was also brewing outside of South Vietnam. Unknown to him, South Vietnam was about to explode. According to the Geneva Accords, both sides were to hold nationwide elections in 1956, so Vietnam would be unified under one government. Ho Chi Minh and his leaders in North Vietnam were assured that they were more popular and that they would win in a free and fair election. They had a reputation for being independence fighters. Also, they were a popular government in the North because of their land reforms and nationalism. Once they won, Ho Chi Minh believed that his dream would be achieved to see Vietnam united under a communist state. Ngo Dinh Diem, on the other hand, wasn't comfortable with the idea of an election. He suspected that Ho Chi Minh and his leaders would win, and then Vietnam would be taken over by communists. So, like he did whenever he feared opposition, he squashed the ideas. Diem had the support of the United States, and with their support, he stubbornly refused to hold the elections. He claimed that the North did not have any political freedom, and that any votes held in the North would be rigged because they were controlled by communism. All peaceful attempts made by Ho Chi Minh to reunify Vietnam were shut down by Diem. This was the beginning of an explosion that would burn across the entire state of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and the rest of the North were pissed by Diem's refusal to hold the elections because it was part of their agreement at the Geneva Accords. Even worse, Ho Chi Minh saw Diem and his leaders as puppets of the West and the colonialists. He believed that Diem was being used to stop the true independence of the Vietnamese people, and he was determined to reunite Vietnam at all costs, even if it included another war. Remember that back in South Vietnam, some old fighters in the Viet Minh stayed behind in the countryside and had already begun to build resistance. Ho Chi Minh, aware of this group, gave the green light for them to begin to take up arms against the South. These old fighters were located in the rural areas where the people were feeling the pain inflicted by Diem's ruthless government. Most of these people also benefited from the reforms of Viet Minh during the First Indochina War and were tired of Diem's government. Soon enough, resistance was formed. In December 1960, a group known as the National Liberation Front, NLF, or the Viet Cong, was formed in Tay Ninh province. On the surface, it was simply a group of forces including former Viet Minh members, oppressed communists, angry locals, and anyone who simply wanted to get rid of Diem. However, beneath the surface, it was a group heavily sponsored by Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam, and they had one goal: overthrowing the government of South Vietnam. You see, Ho Chí Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap were at work again. This time, they wanted to unite Vietnam by all means. Ho Chí Minh knew that they couldn't come out openly to fight against Diem's government. If they even dared to invade the South, it would trigger the United States to intervene immediately. The only way to topple Diem was by using internal means. It had to look like the people of South Vietnam were against the government, even though it would all be directed from Hanoi. General Giap once again had to rely on the tactics that had helped them defeat the French, guerrilla warfare. From North Vietnam, he would control and direct these tactics to the NLF or had to come up with a plan. This plan were killed by enemies who knew the terrain far better than they did. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong was no longer a small insurgent group. They were a full guerrilla army and launched bolder and more coordinated attacks that put President Diem under intense pressure. But if you think Diem was sitting down the entire time watching them overthrow him, then you couldn't be more wrong. Ngo Dinh Diem, upon hearing about the insurgents in the countryside, instantly knew they were communists trying to topple his regime. In his typical style, his government imprisoned and killed anyone who was a suspected communist and conducted crackdowns in the countryside. His soldiers would raid villages where they thought communists were hiding, destroy houses, and kill suspects. Yet, instead of suppressing his opposition, his drastic crackdowns only swelled the flames. If you're wondering why, it was because Diem and his forces didn't know that aside from their military training, the Viet Cong also had another secret. This secret was also a major strength for them and worked to further ruin Diem's reputation and make it difficult for him. You see, the Viet Cong knew how to blend with the local population and mix with the villagers. They had stayed in the south, so they knew most of the villages. To make matters worse, Diem and his government were seen as corrupt, harsh, and oppressive. The Viet Cong would promise these villagers that, should they win the fight, they would conduct land reforms similar to what was happening in the north, and would fight those wealthy elites controlling the south. For this reason, it was easy for them to get support from villagers. These villagers would shelter the Viet Cong fighters and hide their weapons. Imperialism were over. But forces outside Vietnam had a different idea. One of those forces was the United States. For the United States, the stakes were much more than the local politics of the Vietnamese people. The stakes were about democracy in Southeast Asia. You see, after World War II, the Soviet Union had grown in power, and the spread of communism was growing. In 1949, mainland China had fallen to communism, and as if that wasn't enough, the United States had also received a recent blow at the time. In July 1953, the bloody Korean War had ended in a stalemate with no winner, and the border revision remained the same. If that was allowed to happen in Vietnam, what would happen to the whole of Southeast Asia? One man in the United States was seriously thinking about this question. That man's name was President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Long before the rise of the Viet Cong, President Eisenhower had been worried about what was happening in Vietnam. It was his worry that gave birth to the domino theory. He spoke about the domino theory for the first time in 1954, after the First Indochina War was ending. Results because of Diem himself and his lack of popular support. President Kennedy and President Ngo Diem had to come up with a new plan to help achieve their goal. This plan was known as the Strategic Hamlets Program. The goal of the program was to secure the rural areas and win the hearts of the villagers. They would build fortified villages to house the locals and lock out the Viet Cong fighters so they could not mix with the villagers. President Kennedy liked the idea and supported it, but you guessed it, the plan also failed and its progress was very slow. They weren't able to win the popular support of the people. You already know why. By the end of 1962, John Kennedy was already beginning to doubt whether or not the U.S. should intervene in the issues brewing in South Vietnam. It was obvious that Diem's government was harsh and authoritarian and not loved by the people. By 1963, Diem persecuted some more Buddhists and people he suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. This action led to widespread protests against Diem. Soon enough, there were plans to overthrow President Ngo Dinh Diem and stage a coup. John F. Kennedy had intelligence about this coup sometime in August, long before it happened. He spoke to his advisors, and they were torn on the issue. Some of them believed that President Diem was the best option for fighting communism, while others thought that he was being authoritarian and it was undermining all their efforts. John F. Kennedy found himself leaning toward the guys who thought Diem was wasting their efforts with his style of government. Things were about to get very interesting and heated. Now, it may interest you to know that the coup in South Vietnam wasn't staged by the Viet Cong, but by Diem's own military officers who were tired of Diem's government. They were still anti-communist, but they didn't like his style of leadership. These officers were men like General Duong Van Minh, who was the leader of the coup, and General Tran Van Don, who was the then army chief. When Kennedy learned of this, he decided that they had nothing to lose. If they could get rid of Diem and still have anti-communist leadership, it would be a win-win. He called for Diem and asked him to sign a document agreeing to resign as president of South Vietnam. If he resigned, then they would offer him American protection. Well, Diem had done everything to keep himself in power. He wasn't about to hand it over so easily now, so he refused. Kennedy, using the help of the CIA, then offered tacit support to the coup plotters. However, things went out of hand. On November 1st, 1963, General Duong Van Minh led a group of officers and staged a coup. They captured Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. By the next day, they were executed.
Within 18 hours, the revolt was over, and a military junta under General Duong Van Minh had taken over. They named Diem's vice president as premier of a caretaker regime which has been recognized by the United States.
President Kennedy felt terrible.
In my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. Comment should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views.
He hadn't imagined that Diem would be assassinated. However, it didn't matter much. Barely 20 days thereafter, on November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy would unfortunately be faced with the same fate. After President Kennedy's assassination, a new man came into office who took on the responsibility of the United States' interest in the situation in Vietnam once again. This man was President Lyndon B. Johnson. Unlike President Kennedy, President Johnson didn't think about his strategy. He believed fully in the domino effect and wanted to secure South Vietnam at all costs. He believed that the United States should not sit on the sidelines and watch Vietnam fall. So he became deeply involved in the conflict. He hadn't sent troops yet, but things were heating up and everything was soon about to change. On August 2nd, 1964, U.S. Navy ships, including the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, were conducting surveillance missions in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The only issue with this was that the Gulf of Turkic was located in the northeastern part of North Vietnam. It bordered major North Vietnam provinces such as Haiphong, Tay Binh, and Quang Ninh. Secondly, these missions carried out by the United States Navy ships were to secretly attack North Vietnamese installations and radar stations. Ho Chí Minh and other North Vietnamese leaders saw this as an attack and decided to confront the ships. On August 2nd, they attacked the USS Maddox. Both sides ended up exchanging fire. Somehow, the Maddox escaped mostly without damage, but the thread of peace had already been broken. 2 days later, there were reports that another U.S. vessel had been attacked. Later on, people would argue whether this second attack happened. In fact, in 2002, much later, it would be revealed by intelligence reports that the attack never even happened. However, at the time, it was more than enough for a very eager President Lyndon Johnson to jump into action. In a matter of days, he spoke to the nation and announced that U.S. forces had been directly attacked by North Vietnam in international waters.
It is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin.
He claimed that the attack was unprovoked, despite their initial reasons for being there in the first place. He also said that this attack was a direct threat to the United States and their interests in Vietnam. He called for the support of the public to engage fully in the war. This was an easy request. Most Americans at the time were already worried about the spread of communism and easily rallied behind their president. With this approval, President Johnson was emboldened and he moved fast. He took the matter to the American Congress, and by August 7th, the Congress gave him what he wanted. They resolved that President Lyndon Johnson had the authority to take all necessary measures to stop any armed attack against U.S. forces and any aggression that was to come. This agreement was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. To put it in simple terms, it was basically a blank check that would allow Johnson to fully get involved in the war. President Johnson had always been eager to squash communist movements in Vietnam, and now that he had the go-ahead, he wasted no time. He marched troops and arms into South Vietnam to help defend the government. However, the Viet Cong were not afraid. They attacked several U.S. military installations in South Vietnam. On the 7th of February 1965, they attacked U.S. troops in Pleiku and ended up killing 8 Americans. Several were wounded. For President Johnson and his advisors, enough was enough. This was the final straw. By March, the United States started an operation that would set North Vietnam on fire and change the history of the war forever. Furious, President Johnson took drastic measures to deal with the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. He came up with a massive campaign that he believed would solve the issue once and for all. This campaign was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a massive bombing campaign that would last for over 3 years. From March 1965 until November 1968, Johnson and the U.S. forces consistently bombed North Vietnam. On the surface, Johnson's goal was simple. It was to cut off the support the Viet Cong got from North Vietnam. They would do this by destroying supply routes, infrastructure, and military bases. However, beneath the surface, there was another reason for such consistent bombing. It was also a psychological war. You see, President Johnson and the U.S. forces hoped that such an amount of consistent and devastating destruction would force Ho Chí Minh and the leaders of North Vietnam to surrender and agree to negotiations. He hoped that the Vietnamese people would see the amount of destruction and break, turning to their government to take the logical option of the negotiation table. It was no ordinary bombing. Everyday bombers flew from military bases in South Vietnam and neighboring countries like Thailand. They dropped tons of bombs in North Vietnam. In the first few months, they bombed depots, bridges, military bases, and supply lines in North Vietnam. Later on, they also began bombing transportation networks. One of these networks was the Ho Chí Minh Trail, which had been used to supply support and weapons to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. However, President Johnson and the U.S. forces were in for a serious surprise. You see, Ho Chí Minh and the leaders of North Vietnam were not fazed by the bombings. Ho Chí Minh soon realized what was happening and decided he would not just sit back and let the U.S. destroy North Vietnam. Once again, he went to his allies, China and the Soviet Union. With their help, they prepared for the bombings. They were able to gather radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-aircraft guns to build an air defense network. With this network, they were able to resist the United States air bombing strikes. They shot down several air vessels and captured several pilots. Strangely, the bombing had only strengthened their resolve in a free and united Vietnam. Under Ho Chí Minh's leadership, the people rebuilt the destroyed bridges and roads. They worked both day and night to also repair the supply lines. Despite the consistent bombing, they worked to restore the Ho Chí Minh Trail and continued to send support to the Viet Cong in the south. It was almost as though the destruction did not affect their activities. The truth was that Ho Chí Minh and his generals soon realized that the American forces weren't going to stop their bombing anytime soon. To deal with this, they began building underground tunnels and started to move more and more of their operations underground. Operation Rolling Thunder was soon becoming a rolling disaster. President Johnson had hoped that it would be fast and quick, but he was appalled to see it dragging on. Soon enough, the American people started to see pictures of bombed cities and villages in North Vietnam. The operation had also killed over 100,000 Vietnamese, including soldiers and civilians. The US Army had also lost over 1,000 lives, and over 500 of their aircraft had been shot down and destroyed beyond repair. The American people were becoming less and less pleased by this war. Soon enough, they took to the streets of America in protests. Left with no choice, President Johnson had to put an end to the relentless bombing in November 1968. However, if you're thinking this meant he was going to give up, then you're in for a surprise. For President Johnson, this wasn't the end. It only meant that he needed to rethink his strategy. He would not be able to defeat Vietnam from the skies. He had to go on the ground to fight them in the cities, in their bases, and in the jungles.
And who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow.
President Johnson then announced that he was sending more foot soldiers to Vietnam and increasing the U.S. presence in Vietnam to almost 500,000 soldiers. His plan was to directly fight the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army in South Vietnam. They hoped that they could save South Vietnam from falling to communism. The ground forces would be sent to areas such as the Mekong Delta, Saigon, the Central Highlands, and the border South Vietnam, shared with the North. This operation would be led by a man who had stayed in South Vietnam for a while and had an understanding of the war. His name was General William Westmoreland. General Westmoreland was the commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam. He had stayed in Vietnam for a while and had a plan of how to defeat their enemies. His plan was for the U.S. Army to conduct large-scale search and destroy missions alongside air support. So, the first thing he did was to set up military bases in places like Cam Ranh Bay, Khe Sanh, and Da Nang. It was from these bases that they launched operations into enemy territory. On the surface, the plan was simple. The search and destroy missions involved helicopters dropping soldiers into jungles that were suspected of hiding Viet Cong fighters. The plan was to simply fight the enemy, destroy their bases, and then quickly withdraw. However, it was harder than it seemed. The terrain was difficult. There were jungles and mountains. To make it worse, there were also rice paddies. These were filled with water and made walking difficult. They were sometimes infested with leeches, and when they weren't, they had booby traps placed by the Viet Cong. This made it almost impossible to find the Viet Cong fighters. The bitter truth was that General Westmoreland had greatly undermined the Viet Cong and their preparations. He didn't know as much as he thought he did. You see, thanks to all the bombings, the North's strategy shifted drastically. The guerrilla fighters moved not just deeper into the jungle, but also moved underground. Beneath the ground, they had an extensive network of tunnels that would stretch for miles. You never knew where one started and where it ended, or where it was leading. These tunnels had rooms that served as living quarters, supplies, weapons, and even hospitals. With the help of these tunnels, they were able to stay elusive. The guerrilla fighters would come out and ambush the U.S. Army and then vanish. Those who were not ambushed or sabotaged struggled to deal with the heat, disease, and traps left for them in the jungle. The Viet Cong soldiers also had a way of blending in with the villagers and then disappearing into the jungle after a brutal attack. If the U.S. Army managed to clear a village by day, the Viet Cong would return by night. No matter the victories they had, the Viet Cong had a way of erasing them. The United States had sent troops, but there was no conventional war. At some point, it started to seem like they were fighting smoke. They were left with only one option if they wanted to get to the Viet Cong: to go into the tunnels. To fight this underground war, the U.S. could not use a typical soldier. They needed special kinds of soldiers. These soldiers were small but courageous. Van Thieu, the South Vietnamese president, wasn't pleased with the U.S. withdrawal. He said that his army was still ill-prepared and that without American support, the scales would be tipped in favor of the North and they would be vulnerable. Despite the protests and his pleading, President Nixon kept to his Vietnamization strategy. He pulled back the forces in batches and promised President Thieu that the United States would support them with both military and financial help. But that wasn't enough. The South Vietnamese army was left fighting dangerous battles that they seemed to lose. One of those was the Viet Cong attacks on the Mekong Delta. President Nixon, however, continued to support South Vietnam in hopes of keeping them afloat. He sent planes, artillery, military supplies, and tanks, but it never looked like it would be enough. President Nixon, on the other hand, told the populace that his strategy was a success. In a public address, he said that South Vietnam was getting more capable by the day and that their army had been strengthened, but in reality, everything was falling apart. Nevertheless, there were still some American soldiers left in South Vietnam, and before leaving, they had to solve the elephant in the room. The Viet Cong continued attacking South Vietnam, which they were majorly able to do because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While North Vietnam didn't officially attack South Vietnam, they had been using this trail since the beginning to send supplies to the Viet Cong. By 1969, it was a little too obvious that to effectively reduce the power of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, they had to close down that trail. Once President Nixon saw this, he decided that they had to strike, and in March 1968, they launched Operation Menu. The goal of the operation was to bomb places where they suspected Ho Chi Minh was and cut off Viet Cong supply lines. However, this time, they wouldn't just be bombing North Vietnam. They would bomb the parts of the trail that went through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia had been very neutral during the war, but there were several Viet Cong hiding places in Cambodia. To do this meant that President Nixon and the United States forces were taking the war outside Vietnam, and that was the catch. They couldn't let this be known by the American public or by Congress. President Nixon had been selling that they were moving out of Vietnam. If the people knew, he feared it would bring huge backlash, mostly because Cambodia and Laos had been neutral since the beginning. He also argued that it was the only way to stop Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam from getting the upper hand. In his opinion, this was necessary if they would ever win the war. They began bombing, a large-scale bombing operation. It was staggering. They dropped over 400,000 tons of bombs in Laos and over 2 million tons in Cambodia. This bombing destroyed several villages. Thousands of civilians in these locations were killed, and some were rendered homeless. To worsen things, the trail continued to function, with the Viet Cong fixing it as soon as it was destroyed. But that wasn't the worst part. Back in America, the news of the bombings leaked and sparked outrage among the people. Everyone was furious. From students to activities and even members of Congress, they felt betrayed. Nixon's biggest nightmare had come true. Feeling betrayed, the crowds returned to the streets in protest. Universities that had been on the front lines of the protests saw the crowds once again. One of those universities where the crowds were beginning to gather was Kent State University in the state of Ohio. Students in the university started a peaceful protest against President Nixon's betrayal on the 1st of May. They were frustrated and angry, and the protests grew constantly in intensity. By the 3rd of May, the governor of Ohio, Governor Rhodes, spoke against the protests, and Kent Mayor Leroy Satcham declared a state of emergency. He also called the National Guard to come out and maintain order, but this wouldn't stop the students from coming out. It furled them. The following day, on May 4th, hundreds of students gathered at Kent State University to protest once more. Under the instruction of the governor, the Ohio State National Guard was also there, armed and ready. The protests swelled with tension, and the officers ended up previous administrations had done. His attempt to have it suppressed, combined with his secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia, only left the people wary of the trustworthiness of his character. For him, this was the beginning of the end. Aside from all that was going wrong at home, Richard Nixon was quickly realizing that things were also going wrong back at the war. After spending years relentlessly bombing Laos and Cambodia, it was becoming clear that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army were tougher than they'd imagined. Now, with mounting protests, President Richard Nixon and his administration had to find a diplomatic way to end this bloody war. However, this wasn't the first time they were exploring diplomatic means. You see, years of a dragged-out war and failed negotiations, he finally managed to bring the United States, South Vietnam, With the United States gone, South Vietnam had to stand on its own. However, the South Vietnamese government was fragile, and its military was still as weak as it had always been. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong continued to cause small bouts of chaos in the rural South until it became very clear that it was no longer a question if North Vietnamese forces would attack South Vietnam. It had become a question of when. In North Vietnam, even though Ho Chí Minh had died in September 1969, General Vo Nguyen Giap was still in control. The political arm of government was now led by Lê Duan. General Giap saw a major chance to achieve their dream of a unified Vietnam. Peace. Accord or not, the United States were finally out of the picture, which left them with only South Vietnam to deal with. He expected it to be easy because not only was South Vietnam militarily weak, they were also unstable, both politically and economically. Despite the Paris Peace Accord, they never had plans of letting South Vietnam remain a separate state forever, and they knew that the South wouldn't allow the election to hold ever. So he and his men began to plan. They knew that without the US troops, they outright outmatched the ARVN. All they needed was one good final push to achieve their goal. And they'd make that effort. That final push would become known as the Ho Chí Minh Campaign in honor of their late leader. General Giap's plan for this final campaign was simple. They were to come with overwhelming force and take advantage of South Vietnamese weak defenses. With this force, they'd be able to capture major cities before the ARVN could ever come up with a plan. The best part? With the peace accord signed, he knew the United States would not intervene. They soon began moving troops towards South Vietnam. In March 1975, they finally attacked, and the Ho Chí Minh Campaign officially began in Buon Ma Thuot, which was in the central highlands of South Vietnam. General Giap believed that if North Vietnamese forces could take control of the central highlands, they would be able to divide South Vietnam in half. This way, they would then be able to cut off supply lines, hence bringing the rest of South Vietnam to its knees, so they moved quickly. They launched a surprise attack on Buon Ma Thuot as planned. They used overwhelming force and, as expected, were able to overpower the ARVN soldiers in Buon Ma Thuot. And in less than 1 week, they had captured the city. South Vietnam was sent into chaos. President Nguyen Van Thieu was unsure what to do. He didn't have a strong military, and there was pressure to act as fast as a reflex. He then made a costly decision to pull back his troops from both the Central Highlands and some northern regions and bring them to strengthen the defenses in the south. This implied that he'd be abandoning major cities, including the city of Hue, leaving them defenseless. This decision would go on to be called the strategic withdrawal. Once he made this decision, everything started to worsen at a much more rapid pace. As the troops pulled out, the people were thrown into panic. They fled the cities, blocking the roads. The South Vietnamese troops were not organized and were further disconcerted by the people's mass exodus. Their retreat was very chaotic. Satisfied with this result, General Giap and his troops marched forward. With the South Vietnamese soldiers retreating further, they easily began capturing city after city. They experienced negligible resistance as they moved on, and this only further strengthened them. The Ho Chi Minh campaign was moving very fast. Soon enough, North Vietnamese forces were about to confidently secure the Central Highlands. After this accomplishment, next, they began to aim for the coastal cities in South Vietnam. They trudged forward.
New regime.
Saigon had fallen. He and his government introduced a set of policies that would change the political and economic structure of the South. The first thing they did was land reforms. They nationalized the agricultural industry and made it a collective state effort. They wanted to stop the capitalist systems in the South. Therefore, nationalizing the agricultural industry was one of the fastest ways to do it. While most of the poor were happy about these changes, several more in the South weren't. They had spent several years fighting against communism and were staunch capitalists. They felt forced by Le Duan and his government to practice communism. So, they formed a small group and started something resembling a resistance. However, Le Duan was smart. He expected that this was likely to happen, so he acted quickly. One of the few things he did to curb this was the creation. These fleeing groups were eventually known as the Boat People. Thousands of South Vietnamese refugees fled through the sea, risking their lives trying to cross the South China Sea to neighboring countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia. It was a huge risk because several of these boats were unsafe and rickety, yet the people risked their lives. It grew into a major crisis as more and more refugees fled Vietnam, traversing over the sea in desperate measures. Many of them died in the sea because the boats were unsafe. Many others died from the sea's treacherous waves, from falling to pirate attacks, and from diseases or hunger and malnourishment. Over 1 million of them fled, and estimatedly half of that population died in the sea. Countries around the world had to open their doors due to the numbers. These countries included Australia, Canada, and the United States. They helped resettle those who were able to make it out alive, unable to stop the humanitarian disaster from happening. However, Le Duan didn't seem bothered by this great exodus. It only strengthened him to further unify the state, and he took one further step in that direction. He went on to rename Saigon as Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the northern leader who had championed their fight for independence and unity. He hoped that this would tell the people of South Vietnam that this was the end of the old regime, and now they were to celebrate their unity. However, those in the South saw it as an insult and a bitter reminder that they had lost their country to the communists. They struggled to adapt to this new system, while Le Duan did his best to maintain control and implement his vision. Even though North and South had been officially reunited physically, they were still very much divided at heart. But the refugees weren't the only consequence of the war. The war had been devastating, lasting over 2 painful decades, and had come at an extreme cost. One of the highest costs was the human cost. The Vietnam War cost the lives of over 3 million people, most of whom were the Vietnamese themselves. About 2 million of them were ordinary civilians caught in the crossfire and bombings across the country. Both the North and South military lost more than 1 million soldiers. The United States had lost over 58,000 members of its force, and while it was a terrible blow to them, it was not comparable to the woes and losses of the Vietnamese. The costs had also been economical. No thanks to the bombings, Vietnam's agriculture came to a halt. One of the saddest stories is of one of the rice paddies at Mekong Delta. The rice paddies at the Mekong Delta that had once been highly prosperous were, by the end of the war, covered with explosives that had yet to explode and made them dangerous to farm in. Several Vietnamese cities had been reduced to rubble and their industries destroyed. But it wasn't just about what was destroyed. It was the consequences of the destruction. For years after the war, Vietnam struggled with food shortages. Their agriculture couldn't sustain them, and their economy was in ruins. There were no meaningful commercial trades during the war, so inflation was at sky-high levels. Le Duan and his government tried to collectivize agriculture in South Vietnam to solve this problem, but the South Vietnamese resisted this move. Even when he tried forcefully, the results weren't great. In fact, they only worsened the already bad economic situation. With no choice, Le Duan turned to China and the Soviet Union for help. They assisted the best they could, but it still wasn't enough. Several of the Southerners fearing Le Duan and his rule became refugees after risking their lives to cross the South China Sea. Those who stayed behind were imprisoned in re-education camps. But one of the most saddening parts of the war was the fate of American prisoners of war and those who were MIA. During the war, over 500 American soldiers were taken to prisons by North Vietnam. These soldiers were held in terrible conditions in prisoner camps in Hanoi. Several U.S. pilots were held in these camps. Even though most of these prisoners were released in 1973 as part of the agreement of the Paris Peace Accord, the issue of those missing in action still remained. For years after the war, several families waited, hoping one day that their relatives who had gone to fight the war would be found. Till date, over 1,000 soldiers are still reported missing in Vietnam. But even those who survived the war still felt the pain. Even though they made it back home, they weren't given the hero's welcome that other soldiers were given.
When I came home, I was subject to a lot of ridicule, verbal abuse.
Most of the American veterans from the Vietnam War returned to a country where the anti-war cry had cast a shadow on their services, and their sacrifice was not appreciated. Several of them had to deal with trauma and PTSD. Several of the tunnel rats returned claustrophobic, and with several other mental issues. They had to deal with this in silence because not only were treatment options not available, but the society they lived in didn't seem to appreciate the war they had fought in. The human costs of the war had been devastating. In Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a quiet reminder of how many American soldiers were lost to the war. There are 58,000 names etched in the granite as a remembrance of their sacrifice. Nonetheless, the war had shown the resilience of the Vietnamese people towards gaining their independence and unity. But how did this war affect the rest of the world? On a global scale, the Vietnam War wasn't just a war in Southeast Asia. It was the battleground for the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. For several years, America's foreign policy was focused on containing the spread of communism. The domino theory, which had first started with President Eisenhower, was the fear that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would also follow. Eisenhower and the presidents after him fought in Vietnam, believing that if they could stop communism in Vietnam, they could stop it from spreading on the continent. They were right because as soon as Saigon fell in 1975, the other states outside Vietnam soon began to fall to communism. Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, backed by the Soviet Union and China, soon brought Cambodia to communist rule. This rule went on to commit one of the worst human rights tragedies in the 20th century by mass executing over 1 million people to achieve his goal of collective agriculture. Laos also fell to communist rule, and the region slowly became what the United States had forced to prevent. But the Vietnam War also forced the United States to take another look at her foreign policy. The first change came in 1973 with the War Powers Act. This legislation was created to prevent the president from sending the U.S. military into war without the Congress giving its consent. This was because of the secret bombings ordered by President Nixon. There was also a growing desire in the United States to prevent ever involving itself in another long and costly war. The act also set limits on how long the United States troops could be sent abroad without the approval of Congress. Aside from that, the United States military also started to prepare for war with an enemy who used guerrilla-style tactics. Their initial strategies had failed against the guerrilla fighters of North Vietnam, and so they started to emphasize studying how to counter-insurgency and understand local territories before a war. This also shaped the style of American operations, especially those in the Middle East, where they also had to fight insurgency once more. However, Southeast Asia had to deal with the long-lasting effects of the war. Not just Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos. They all had unexploded ordnances that prevented them from ever using parts of their land. It was a long war that left deep scars. In the end, the war was a fight for the independence and unification of Vietnam.